My son kicked me out for being an extra mouth, so I bought their building and tripled rent. You might think I am exaggerating, but I assure you, I am not. I lived every aching second of it, and when I tell you what happened, you will see exactly why I chose to take the path I did. It began on an evening that should have been ordinary, yet it split my world in two. I had just returned home from a walk around the block. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and comment where you are watching from. My knees ached from years of hard work, but I carried myself with quiet dignity as I always had. I thought the house I helped pay for, the very home whose foundation I helped lay brick by brick, would always be my refuge. Instead, it became the scene of my greatest humiliation. My son stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, his wife beside him with a smirk that cut deeper than any knife. He said, with no hesitation, no trace of remorse, "Dad, you're just an extra mouth to feed. We can't keep supporting you." My heart stopped. My own flesh and blood. The boy I worked double shifts to raise, the boy I skipped meals for so he could eat, was looking at me as though I were nothing. Not a father, not a provider, not a man who gave up his entire life for him, just an extra mouth. I asked him to repeat himself, praying I had misheard, but he did not falter. His wife chimed in, saying it was time I learned to be independent, as if at my age independence was a simple thing. My hands trembled, and I gripped the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. I wanted to shout, to remind them of every sacrifice I had ever made, but the words caught in my throat like thorns. Then came the final blow. My son walked over to the door, placed my worn suitcase by the threshold, and told me I could no longer stay. That was it. No conversation, no discussion. Just an execution of judgment passed without mercy. I stood there, staring at the boy I once carried on my shoulders, the boy whose tears I wiped away when the world seemed too cruel. Now he was the cruel one, and he wore it like armor. In that moment, the world turned cold. The walls of the house seemed to push me out, as if they no longer recognized me. The family photos on the mantel blurred through my tears, mocking me with memories of smiles and laughter that no longer belonged to me. I walked out with nothing but my bag, the air heavy with betrayal. I never thought the day would come when my own son would see me not as a father, but as a burden. Yet that was the night it happened, and it was only the beginning. I remember the years of sacrifice as if they were etched into my bones, years where every sunrise meant another chance to provide for my son, even if it meant tearing pieces of myself away. I worked overtime shifts that stretched until my eyes burned and my back felt as though it would snap in two, and yet I never complained, because every hour meant another meal on his plate, another book in his school bag, another pair of shoes to keep his feet dry when it rained. I missed meals so he would not have to. I drank water when I was hungry and told myself that seeing him smile was nourishment enough. There were nights when I returned home from the factory too tired to stand, but I still found the strength to look over his homework, to pat his head and tell him he was destined for greatness because I believed it with every fiber of my being. When the bills piled up higher than the food on our table, I sold my possessions one by one, stripping my life down to bare essentials so his life could be filled with opportunity. My old watch, the one gift I had ever received from my father, gone. My guitar, the only luxury I had allowed myself in youth, sold for textbooks. Even my wedding ring, a circle of gold that had once symbolized a lifetime of promise, was pawned so he could attend a school trip because I could not stand to see him left behind while his classmates went ahead. Every sacrifice I made willingly, without bitterness, because I believed that was what a father was meant to do. And in those moments when exhaustion made my hands tremble and despair whispered in my ear, I would remind myself that it was temporary, that one day he would look back and understand, that he would see the lengths I went to for him, and he would honor me for it. But that day never came. Instead, when he grew older, he grew distant, his gratitude replaced by entitlement, his respect replaced by disdain. I remember working myself sick to pay for his college tuition, swallowing my pride to take out loans, and when he graduated, instead of thanks, he told people he had done it all on his own. I remember skipping meals so he could have enough, and later hearing him mock me for being frugal, as if I had chosen to live with less out of weakness rather than devotion. All the years I spent protecting him, providing for him, building a foundation from the rubble of my own life, were dismissed with cold indifference. And when the final insult came, when he called me an extra mouth to feed, it was as though he had taken every sacrifice, every tear, every drop of blood and sweat I had poured into him and set them on fire. The son I had starved for, the son I had labored for, could not see the Father behind the sacrifices. He saw only a burden, and that truth cut me deeper than any hunger ever had. The memory of that night will never leave me, because it was the night every illusion I had about family shattered before my eyes, the night when my love and sacrifice were repaid with cruelty. I walked into the living room expecting nothing more than a quiet evening, but instead I saw my suitcase sitting by the door, already packed, as though I were some stranger passing through, rather than the man who had given decades of his life to that very household. My son stood there with his arms folded, his face cold and unyielding, while my daughter-in-law leaned casually against the wall, a smirk tugging at her lips that made my stomach turn. I asked, my voice trembling, what this meant, and it was she who answered first, her tone laced with disdain as she said, "We need the space for ourselves." She looked at me as though I were an object cluttering her pristine home, as though my presence was a stain she had long been eager to wash away. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to my son, desperate for him to contradict her, to tell me this was some mistake, but he only nodded and said it was time for me to leave, that I could not stay in their home any longer. I felt my knees weaken, my breath catch in my throat, because I could not reconcile the boy I raised, the boy I once cradled in my arms, with the man now standing before me, his voice hard and unfamiliar. I reminded him that I had helped build this house, not just with money but with my own hands, laying the foundation, painting the walls, repairing every broken thing when they called for me, and he brushed it off as though it meant nothing. "That was then," he said, "but now you're just another responsibility we don't need." Those words struck me harder than any blow ever could. I stood there in silence, staring at the suitcase, at the life they had so neatly packed away, and the smirk on my daughter-in-law's face burned itself into my memory. She whispered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear, "We finally have our home to ourselves." The contempt in her tone was unmistakable, and in that instant I knew she had wanted me gone for a long time, her wish finally granted by the very son I had poured my soul into raising. With my dignity clinging to me by a thread, I picked up the suitcase, the weight of it nothing compared to the weight in my chest. I walked out into the night without another word, my body moving but my spirit shattered, the sound of the door closing behind me echoing louder than any storm. That was the final insult, the cruel severing of ties, the moment when my son chose his comfort over my existence, and it was in that silence, with the cool night air biting at my skin, that the seeds of my resolve were planted. I remember stepping out into the night with my suitcase in hand, the air heavy and still, the kind of silence that pressed down on me until it felt suffocating. And every step I took down that empty street was a reminder of the betrayal I had just endured. The streetlights glowed faintly, casting long shadows across the pavement, and I could hear the faint scuff of my shoes dragging against the ground, as though even my body resisted leaving the home I had given everything for. I had nowhere to go, no destination in mind, just the need to keep moving, because if I stopped, I feared the weight of what had just happened would crush me entirely. Each house I passed seemed to mock me, the warm glow from behind their curtains a cruel reminder of the family I no longer had, the comfort I had been cast out of. My chest ached with more than age, it ached with betrayal so sharp it cut through flesh and bone, leaving only a hollow echo where a father's pride used to be. I thought of all the nights I had walked those same streets after a late shift, my heart lifted by the thought of returning to a son who depended on me, who loved me, or so I had believed. Now, that same road felt endless, barren, stripped of meaning, and every flickering lamp above seemed like an eye watching me, whispering that I was alone. Betrayal is louder than silence, and that night it screamed in my ears, the words "extra mouth to feed" pounding through my skull with every step. My mind replayed their faces, my son's indifference and my daughter-in-law's smirk over and over until I wanted to tear the images from my memory, but they clung to me like a second skin. I paused once, at the corner of the street, setting my suitcase down because my arms shook from more than just fatigue. I looked back at the house, my house, the home I had poured my blood into, and it stood there glowing with the comfort they had stolen from me. My eyes blurred with tears, the lights turning into streaks, and I whispered to myself, asking how it had come to this, how a lifetime of sacrifice could lead to exile. The silence answered with nothing, and that nothing was louder than any voice I had ever known. I walked on, the cold biting into my skin, my body shivering not from the wind, but from the emptiness within me. I felt invisible, as if the world had closed its doors on me entirely, as if I had become a ghost wandering streets that no longer remembered my name. That night was not just the loss of a home, it was the loss of identity, of family, of the belief that love and sacrifice could ever guarantee loyalty. Alone, betrayed and broken, I carried myself forward, each step heavier than the last, knowing nothing would ever be the same again. I walked for hours that night, slow steps eating up the pavement, until the streetlights thinned and my feet found themselves near the low hum of their kitchen window. I had meant to keep walking, to let the darkness swallow me and the hurt with it, but a foolish part of me wanted one last look, one last impossible hope that the faces inside would be softer than I remembered. I stopped beneath the brittle glow of a porch lamp and pressed my ear to the cool glass, not thinking of dignity or shame, only of the need to hear the truth one final time. What I heard was worse than any imagined cruelty. Their laughter spilled into the hallway like something spilled carelessly from a cup, bright and sharp and mocking. My son was saying things I could not believe were coming from him, words so small and precise they were like knives. He called me a burden, a dead weight, an extra mouth. His voice was light, almost amused, as if he were recounting a private joke, and the sound of it made my hands clench without me meaning to. Beside him his wife was laughing too, not the polite laugh of people amused by a story, but the hard, brittle laugh of people who take pleasure in another's misfortune. They mapped every sacrifice I had made into punchlines, trading memories of my tireless nights and empty meals for quips and jests. I heard them mimic the ways I used to speak, the small phrases I had repeated to encourage him, and they turned them into ridicule. The sound of their mockery wrapped around me and made my chest hollow. I felt every penny I had spent and every hour I had worked slip away like water through fingers. They joked about finally getting rid of me as if I were a bad tenant they had finally evicted and not their father. They counted the money they believed they had saved, now that I would no longer be at their table, as if my presence had been nothing but a balance sheet to be adjusted. I listened as they planned new comforts for themselves, whispering extravagant wants, with the casual cruelty of people who assume all good things come without cost. My son laughed about how relieved he would be to sleep without worrying about bills, and then, with a vindictive flourish, he invented reasons I would not be missed, painting me in the smallest strokes until even my history with them looked like a cheap backdrop. I wanted to burst through the door, to confront them with the man they had been and the man they had become, to force their eyes to meet mine but the air in my lungs tightened, and the only sound I made was a dry swallow. Memory is a strange thing. In that moment, the past replayed itself, each sacrifice laid down like bricks, each brick now mocked by the voices that had been built upon them. I tried to remind myself that people can be cruel when ashamed, that their laughter might be a mask for guilt, but every selfish giggle stabbed that theory to death. The neighbors' curtains were closed, the night indifferent, and their words reached me unfiltered, as precise as an accusation. When they finally fell silent, when the light in the kitchen shifted from high to low and the house settled into a careless sleep, I stayed where I was, ear pressed to the cold air, letting their contempt sink in. Their cruelty was not a sudden thing. It was the accumulated weight of years of unnoticed slights and selfish choices, and hearing it like that, reduced to punchlines in their living room, changed me. I had loved blindly and labored without expectation, and now I had been reduced to a caricature in the very place I had built a life. The laughter faded, but its echo remained, following me as I walked away, hardening into something else. It turned my grief into a resolve that would not let me break in the dark. As I walked farther from the house, each step carrying me deeper into the night, the ache in my chest began to change shape. At first it was grief, raw and suffocating, the kind of pain that makes your legs feel weak and your hands tremble uncontrollably. But slowly it sharpened into something else, something that steadied me rather than crushed me. Hurt hardened into anger, and anger began to take the form of resolve. My mind replayed the moments when I had saved them from ruin, and the memories flooded in, uninvited, each one a cruel reminder of how much they owed to me and how casually they spat in my face in return. I remembered the time my son lost his job after college, too proud to admit his failings to anyone else. He came home broken, his wife whispering of debts piling up, and it was me who emptied what little I had saved to keep the lights on and the bills paid. I remember selling off the last of my tools, the same tools I had once used to build our home, just so they wouldn't have to face eviction. They never thanked me then. Instead, they acted as though it was their right to be rescued. I remembered when their car broke down, stranding them on the side of the road, and it was me who trudged through the rain to bring them help, me who dipped into my dwindling pension to cover the repairs because they claimed they couldn't afford it. And yet tonight, they dared to tell me I was nothing but an extra mouth to feed, as though my existence was a burden they had been forced to endure. Each memory made my jaw clench tighter, my fists close harder, until I could feel the blood pulsing hot in my veins. I thought of every meal I had skipped, every night I had worked while my body cried out for rest, and the faces of those sacrifices stared back at me like ghosts. I had stood between them and disaster countless times, holding up their fragile world when it threatened to collapse, and now they cast me aside as if I were no more than the dust beneath their feet. Betrayal of that kind is not just cruel, it is deliberate, it is chosen, and knowing they chose to see me as nothing more than dead weight ignited a fire inside me I did not know was still there. The sorrow in my chest began to transform into a steady, simmering anger, one that whispered not of defeat, but of action. They believed they had rid themselves of me, silenced me, erased me from the picture of their perfect life. But I knew better now. I knew that I would not be erased. They had mistaken my patience for weakness, my sacrifices for obligation, and they believed I would simply disappear into the night, grateful for the scraps they had given me in the past. They underestimated me, and in that underestimation, they made their first mistake. I swore to myself, under the cold light of the moon, that I would not rest until they understood the weight of every sacrifice I had ever made, not through my words, but through consequences so undeniable they would regret ever calling me a burden. Hurt had made me bleed, but anger was making me whole again, stitching me together with steel, and in that moment I resolved that I would rise from their betrayal not as a broken man, but as a reckoning. They believed I had nothing, that by pushing me out with a suitcase and cruel words I would wither away into obscurity. But what they never realized was that beneath the surface of the humble, selfless man they dismissed, I had been preparing quietly for years. They saw only the tired father, the aging man who worked himself raw and lived simply, but they never asked how I managed to survive those long stretches of scarcity, how I kept us afloat when times were hardest. They thought I scraped by with luck, when in truth it was discipline. Every extra dollar I ever managed to put aside, I saved. I did not drink, I did not gamble, I did not chase fleeting comforts. While they bought gadgets, vacations, and luxuries they could not afford, I tucked away my modest earnings into accounts they never bothered to ask about. They assumed I had nothing left after helping them with their endless crises, but they were blind to the fact that my sacrifices were not made recklessly. I had always kept something for the future, for the unknown storm. Over time, those quiet savings grew, modest but steady, nurtured by my refusal to waste what little I had. What they also failed to know was that I had a good standing with bankers, men and women who respected me for never defaulting, never missing a payment, no matter how small or large. They remembered me as the man who paid his debts in full, who never lived beyond his means, who carried himself with honesty in every transaction. To my son and his wife, I was an old man with no influence, but in the eyes of bankers and professionals, I was trustworthy, and that trust was worth more than gold. And there was another truth they never saw. My years of sacrifice had given me a strange education of my own. I had learned about property not through lectures or classrooms, but through lived experience. Every broken pipe I fixed, every repair I made to keep a roof over our heads, every bill I negotiated or late payment I fought to cover gave me knowledge of how homes and buildings function, how ownership works, and how landlords and tenants move in this world. They saw me as powerless because I never flaunted what I knew, but ignorance had been their choice, not mine. The irony of it all was clear to me as I walked through the empty streets with betrayal still stinging in my ears, while they had mocked me for being careful with money, while they sneered at my frugality and called me old-fashioned. I had been quietly building a foundation they could not see. They imagined me penniless and broken, when in truth I had savings, I had credibility, and I had knowledge. They had stripped me of dignity, but not of power. Their arrogance made them blind, and that blindness would be the very tool I used against them, because in dismissing me as an extra mouth, they overlooked the truth that I was far from finished, and I still held cards they never knew existed. The morning after my exile, I rose from a bed that was not my own, a cot in a small rented room where the walls seemed to lean in on me, and I told myself that if I was to survive this betrayal, I needed to move with purpose. The anger that had taken root in me had grown firm overnight, and with it came a clarity I had not felt in years. My son thought me powerless, a man without direction, but I knew better, and so I gathered my documents, the proof of my savings, my records with the bank, and I walked into the office of a real estate agency with my head held high. The receptionist greeted me politely, but it was the agent himself who surprised me. A man younger than my son, dressed in a sharp suit, looked me over not with pity, but with respect. He extended his hand firmly and called me "Sir," and in that moment I felt the first flicker of dignity return. He sat me down across from his desk, offered me coffee without hesitation, and asked what opportunities I was interested in. I could hear the sincerity in his tone. He did not see me as an extra mouth to feed, but as a client with the right to be heard. I laid out my situation plainly, telling him I had money to invest, and I was looking for something stable, something that would provide security. He listened carefully, nodding, taking notes, asking questions not out of doubt, but out of genuine interest. I spoke of my years of sacrifice, of how I had learned to see the value in property, how I had repaired homes with my own hands and understood what it took to keep them standing. Instead of dismissing me, he leaned in, impressed that I carried both experience and funds. Together, we went over listings, buildings, and prospects. He showed me possibilities, and for the first time since my betrayal, the horizon did not look dark but filled with openings. He respected my opinions, asked what I thought of neighborhoods, of rental trends, and when I gave my reasoning, he treated it with weight. As he flipped through files, my eyes caught on one particular property, and he noticed the way I stilled. It was an apartment building, modest yet steady in income, with tenants already in place. My chest tightened as I saw the address, for it was familiar to me, hauntingly so. But I said nothing yet, only asking him to tell me more. He described the owner, an older man ready to retire, looking to sell quickly to someone reliable. He explained the income potential, the location, the advantages. I nodded, though inside a storm was beginning to stir. For in that moment, I realized fate was placing something into my hands, something more powerful than any words of vengeance I could have uttered. The agent treated me as a valued client, and that validation gave me strength. He saw me as capable, and because of that, I saw myself that way again. And as we shook hands to schedule the next steps, I knew the path of my revenge was beginning to reveal itself. When the agent called me back a few days later, I walked into his office with my documents neatly folded under my arm and a cautious hope stirring in my chest. We sat down across from one another, and he slid a folder toward me, his expression one of quiet confidence. "I think I've found something that suits your needs," he said, and as I opened the folder, my eyes locked on the familiar address typed in bold at the top of the page. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. I blinked, read it again, and the truth sank in like a stone thrown into still water. It was their building, the very apartment complex where my son and his wife lived. My pulse quickened, my fingers tightening around the edges of the papers until the paper creased beneath them. I tried to keep my voice even as I asked him to tell me more. He explained that the current landlord was an older man, ready to retire, uninterested in managing tenants any longer. The property had been well maintained, the tenants long-term, and the income steady. But the owner simply wanted out. The price, while not insignificant, was within reach for someone with the right savings and credit history, and as he spoke, I felt the walls around me vibrate with the weight of what I was hearing. By chance, or perhaps fate itself, the very roof over their heads was being offered to me. My mind flooded with memories of that night when they cast me out, my suitcase at the door, their words sharp as knives. I remembered the laughter I overheard through the thin glass, the way they mocked me as a burden, and now, before me lay a chance not only to reclaim my dignity but to hold the power they once lorded over me. I sat back in the chair, forcing myself to breathe evenly, forcing the storm inside me into silence. I asked questions as though it were just another listing, nodding, pretending to weigh the pros and cons, but inside, my resolve hardened into steel. They believed they had cut me off, stripped me of everything, reduced me to nothing more than a ghost wandering the streets. But now, the house they thought was theirs alone, the life they believed secure, was balanced precariously on the edge of my decision. The agent went on about rental trends, about the neighborhood's growth, about how quickly the property might sell. I listened, but my thoughts were fixed on the irony, on the cruel and perfect symmetry of it all. They had cast me out without a thought, and yet here I was, being handed the key to their future. Chance, some might call it, but to me it felt like justice waiting to be delivered. When I closed the folder, I looked the agent in the eye and told him calmly, "I'm very interested." The idea hit me like a thunderclap, sudden and impossible to ignore, and for a moment the world narrowed down to a single, bright point of possibility. I could buy it. I could own the very roof over their heads. The thought was so outrageous that it frightened me and exhilarated me at the same time, as if some long-buried part of me had been waiting for permission to rise. I imagined the keys in my hand, the papers signed, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the place where they had laughed at me and labeled me a burden would now be under my name. It was not merely revenge for revenge's sake. It was about justice. It was about balance. It was about taking back the dignity they had ripped from me with a single cruel sentence. I sat there in the agent's office, the offer sheet trembling slightly in my fingers, and watched the idea unfurl into a plan. Of course, there were obstacles. The price was significant, the paperwork complex, the logistics of purchasing a building with tenants already in place, messy and fraught with rules. I had to consider my savings, the loans I could secure, the interest rates, the timeline, and the consequences of owning a building that housed people I knew intimately. But each barrier felt less like an impediment and more like a series of steps I could climb if I chose to. I remembered the years I had sacrificed to build a cushion for lean times. Those small, stubborn deposits into accounts no one knew about now felt like seeds planted with intention. My standing with the bank, once a quiet testament to my reliability, suddenly looked like leverage. The knowledge I had accumulated over decades of fixing pipes and negotiating repairs and understanding the rhythms of landlords and tenants was not romantic or glamorous, but it was practical and valuable. I was not some naive old man dreaming of poetic justice. I was a man with resources and knowledge and a plan, The more I thought about it, the less distant the idea seemed. I pictured the paperwork, the signatures, the notary stamp, the transfer of ownership. I imagined sending out notices, not out of malice, but out of necessity, and watching my son and his wife scramble as their comfortable life adjusted to new realities. But beyond the image of their discomfort, a deeper satisfaction rose inside me, the satisfaction of reclaiming control over my story. For so long I had been reduced to a footnote in their narrative, an unpaid debt that could be dismissed at will. Buying the building would rewrite that sentence. It would make them account for me in a way they had refused to do when love and decency might have asked them to. I allowed myself a cold, measured calculation. If I could secure financing, I could make an offer that would be taken seriously. I could remain discreet until the sale closed, preventing them from undermining the purchase or manipulating the landlord. I could enlist the help of competent professionals, a lawyer who respected my sense of right, an accountant who could structure the deal, and the agent who had treated me like a human being and a client worth listening to. The plan was not cruel in its architecture. It was precise and legal. It would reveal something my son and his wife had forgotten. Respect is not only given, it can be required by circumstance. Still, beneath the strategy pulsed something more primal, the need to be seen, not for vengeance alone, but to stand tall again in the face of those who had rendered me invisible. I thought about the nights I had spent alone on a rented cot, the humiliation of that suitcase by the door, the echo of the words extra mouth to feed, and I felt a resolve that did not care whether others understood the choice I was about to make. I would not be erased. If they had made a home without me in mind, I would make sure that home acknowledged me by law and by fact. I no longer wanted to beg for recognition. I would buy it. I moved like a shadow then, careful and intentional, because rage had taught me patience, and patience had sharpened me into someone precise. The night of my exile still burned in my chest, but I refused to let anger make me reckless. Instead, I harnessed it, turned it into fuel. I began with my savings, those quiet accounts I had nurtured in silence while my son and his wife assumed I had nothing left. For years, every time I skipped a meal, every time I sold a possession to make ends meet, I had put aside a little, disciplined and unwavering, and now those small sums had grown into something powerful. I transferred them into a secure account, one the bank would not parade in its day-to-day dealings, and I called upon the professionals I trusted to help me execute my plan. The first was a lawyer, a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for discretion. She listened to me not with pity but with respect, treating my intentions as legitimate, my resources as worthy. I told her plainly what I wanted: to purchase the building quietly, to ensure my name remained hidden until every document was signed and every stamp affixed. She suggested a limited liability company, a shield of legality that would allow me to act without revealing myself too soon. Within days, she had drafted the paperwork, and I signed my name to something more powerful than any apology my son could have offered. Next came the banker, a man who had known me for decades, who had seen me walk into his office with modest loans, and who had watched me pay every cent back on time. He knew my character, knew my history, and when I told him I needed financing to close a property deal, he did not dismiss me as an old fool. He asked for records, for proof of funds, for clarity. I gave him everything, clean and honest. He reviewed it carefully, nodded, and approved the loan that would bridge the gap between my savings and the seller's price. It was not charity. It was trust, earned through years of reliability. The agent, the same one who had shown me the folder with the building's address, handled the negotiations. He was professional, efficient, and most importantly, respectful. He did not see me as an extra mouth to feed, but as a client with the means to act. He arranged inspections, walked the property with me, explained tenant agreements, and together we crafted an offer that was strong and swift. The seller, tired of managing tenants and eager to retire, accepted almost immediately. My lawyer handled the closing process like a surgeon, checking for liens, verifying titles, and ensuring nothing could interfere. The day I signed the closing documents, I sat still for a long time, letting the weight of it sink in. On paper, the building now belonged to a corporate entity, faceless and ordinary, but in truth, it was mine. My son and his wife still laughed under its roof, oblivious, thinking their lives secure. They had cast me aside, blind to the fact that I still had strength, blind to the patience that had defined me for decades. With every signature, with every discreet move, I reclaimed my dignity. They had called me powerless, a burden, but I was now the silent master of their home. The plan was in motion, and there was no turning back. The days that followed felt like an endless test of my resolve, a slow-burning suspense that demanded I hold my silence when every fiber of me longed to reveal the truth. I lived humbly and quietly, renting a modest room with bare walls and a single bed, my suitcase tucked neatly in the corner as if to remind me of the night I was cast out. The room was small, but it was mine, and for the first time in a long while I felt a strange sense of control simmering beneath the surface. I had signed the papers, secured the building, and yet I kept my victory hidden. My son and his wife had no idea that their smug security rested on ground that no longer belonged to them. Instead, I watched from the shadows, moving through the neighborhood in silence, observing the life they flaunted without shame. They were loud in their celebrations, as if my absence had granted them freedom. I overheard him one afternoon while he stood outside with his friends, his voice carrying across the pavement with a careless arrogance that twisted my stomach. "I finally cut off the dead weight," he said, puffing his chest with pride. The laughter of his companions followed, crude and echoing, as if my erasure was something heroic. I stayed still, my face hidden beneath the brim of my cap, and let the words cut into me, each syllable searing deeper than the last. Dead weight. That was how he saw me, how he framed me to the world. Not as a father who had bled for his future, but as ballast he had thrown overboard to keep his own ship afloat. I clenched my hands until my nails bit into my palms, reminding myself that silence was my weapon now, patience my shield. I could not afford to reveal myself too soon. I could not squander the chance that fate had given me by indulging in a moment of rage. Instead, I turned my fury inward, letting it harden into resolve. At night, I would sit in the dim glow of a single lamp in my rented room, reading over the documents again, running my fingers across the embossed stamps and signatures, reassuring myself that it was real, that the building was mine. I rehearsed the moment of revelation in my mind over and over, imagining the look on his face when the truth came crashing down. Every boast he made, every cruel word that spilled from his lips in my absence, only made that vision sharper, clearer. Suspense became fuel, and I learned to savor it. They thought they had silenced me, erased me from their lives, but I was watching, waiting, biding my time in the shadows. And with each passing day, their arrogance grew, and so too did the justice that was coming for them. My silence was not weakness, it was the calm before the storm, and the storm was almost ready to break. The day of the closing arrived with no fanfare, just a gray sky and the steady ticking of the clock on the lawyer's office wall, but for me it carried the weight of a lifetime. I sat at the polished wooden table with the documents neatly stacked before me, each page dense with numbers and clauses, and at the bottom of every sheet there was a line waiting for my name. My lawyer guided me through each section with calm precision, her pen poised to point out the places where I needed to sign, and with every stroke of ink I felt something inside me settle. My hand did not shake, my breath did not falter. The signatures came one after another, and with each one I felt a piece of the past loosen its grip on me. When the final page was signed, I set the pen down and leaned back in the chair, staring at the stack of papers that now bound my son's future to my will. The ink dried, and with it dried the last trace of hesitation, the last whisper of doubt that maybe I should forgive, that maybe I should accept my role as the cast-out father who faded quietly into the background. No, that man no longer existed. The banker confirmed the transfer, the funds moving from escrow with clinical efficiency, and the seller shook my hand with a tired smile, relieved to finally be free of his burden. He had no idea that for me this was not a burden but a weapon, sharpened and ready. The deed was filed, the property transferred, and though the public record bore only the name of the limited liability company, I knew the truth. I was the owner. I was the one who held the power now. I walked out of that office into the cold air, and the world looked different. The streets no longer felt heavy with betrayal. They felt like a stage where the curtain had not yet risen. I passed by the building later that evening, its windows glowing with the warmth of families inside, including my son and his wife. They laughed, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had shifted, that their landlord was no longer a distant man ready to retire, but the very father they had cast aside. I stood in the shadows and allowed myself a thin smile, not of joy, but of vindication. They had thought me powerless, but the law itself now said otherwise. They had mocked me as a burden, but I had just signed the papers that proved I was the one holding the strings. The ink was dry, and so was my hesitation. All that remained now was the execution of the plan, and when that day came, there would be no going back, no chance for them to undo what they had done. I was no longer the extra mouth to feed. I was the master of the roof over their heads. The first move came quietly, on crisp sheets of paper slipped into envelopes and delivered to every mailbox in the building. Notices of new ownership and new terms, drafted carefully by my lawyer and signed with the authority that now rested in my hands, made their way into the lives of every tenant. The language was formal, detached, the kind of legal phrasing that offered no warmth and left no room for argument. It stated clearly that beginning the following month, rent would increase tripled from what it had been before. It was a number that would shock them, a figure designed not just to collect, but to command attention. I knew it would send whispers rushing through the halls like a sudden storm, and it did. Tenants gathered in stairwells, their voices hushed and frantic, wondering who the new landlord was, why the increase was so steep, and what would become of them if they could not pay. I heard their words when I lingered outside, blending into the background as I had always done, their panic rolling through the walls that once echoed with my son's arrogance. Some cursed the faceless new owner. Others feared they would have to leave the homes they had lived in for years. The tension grew with every hour, the unease spreading until it reached the ears of the very people who had driven me from their door. My son, proud and overconfident, was quick to dismiss it. I heard him in the courtyard, his voice raised to reassure his wife and anyone else who would listen. "We'll handle it," he said, his tone dripping with the arrogance I knew so well. "It's probably just some greedy landlord testing us. They'll back down once they see we're not scared." His wife stood beside him, her arms crossed, her smirk firmly in place as she muttered about fighting it, about knowing their rights, about how no one could push them around. They treated it like an inconvenience, a challenge to be brushed aside, still blind to the reality that the landlord was not some distant stranger, but me, the very man they had cast out. I watched them from a distance, the irony sharp enough to cut through the chill of the evening. They believed they were untouchable, that no matter what notice was pinned to their door, they would find a way to remain comfortable. They had not yet understood that this time there was no pleading, no negotiation, no quiet father ready to empty his pockets to save them from consequence. This time the law stood on my side, the ink on the deed unshakable. Their confidence was a mask, one I knew would crack the moment they realized the truth. And so I waited, letting the whispers swell, letting the panic build, while the notice sat on their table like a ticking clock. They thought they could handle it, but soon they would learn that what they faced was not some greedy landlord, but the weight of their own betrayal returned to them in kind. The day the new rent bill arrived was the day their false confidence finally cracked, and I had been waiting for that moment with a patience sharpened by months of humiliation. The envelope came like all the others, slipped under their door without ceremony, but its contents were a hammer blow to their arrogance. My son tore it open at the kitchen table, and I can still imagine the way his face twisted as he read the figures. His voice rose instantly, sharp and indignant, calling out to his wife that the new landlord was insane, that no one could possibly expect tenants to pay triple the rent. She snatched the paper from his hand and read it herself, her smirk evaporating in seconds, replaced by a sneer of disbelief. "This is robbery," she hissed, her voice trembling with outrage. "Whoever this new owner is, they're nothing but a greedy leech. They think they can scare us into paying?" Their anger was loud, unchecked, filling the apartment with echoes that spilled into the hall. Neighbors heard them shouting, heard the curses hurled against the faceless landlord they had invented in their minds. They raged about fairness, about rights, about how unjust it was to be treated like this, their voices laced with panic even as they tried to hide it behind bravado. My son slammed his fist on the table, declaring that he would never be pushed around, that he had a family to protect, that no landlord had the right to bleed them dry. His wife chimed in with venom, promising she would find out who this person was and drag their name through the mud. To them, the landlord was an enemy born of greed and cruelty, a faceless villain to direct their fury toward. They never paused to consider that the enemy was me, the father they had discarded, the man they had dismissed as nothing but an extra mouth to feed. The irony was delicious, their outrage a bitter song that played sweetly in my ears. From my quiet distance I watched the storm unfold, imagining the way their confidence shrank with every repetition of those numbers, with every glance at a bill they could not afford. They cursed the landlord with words that once they had reserved for me, and I let them, because each insult was a testament to how blind they remained. They thought themselves victims, but in truth they were only reaping the harvest of their own cruelty. Their anger did not frighten me, it fueled me. They were powerless now, railing against shadows, while I sat with the deed in my possession, the law on my side, and the final reveal waiting just beyond the horizon. They believed they could fight this phantom landlord, demand mercy, or rally the tenants to their cause, but they did not yet understand that this was not a negotiation. This was justice clothed in legality, and their rage was nothing more than a futile storm battering against walls they no longer controlled. I walked into the building office with the same steady feet I had used to cross factory floors for decades, my hands folded around the small stack of papers that would finish what had been set in motion months before. The clerk looked up, surprised, then polite, offering a thin smile that faltered when I gave him the corporate name and the quiet confirmation he needed to find the account. There was no fanfare, no drum roll, no dramatic reveal staged for an audience. That is not how this was meant to feel. This was work done by careful hands, by signatures and ledgers, by the patient accumulation of proof and presence. The agent who had guided me there stood a few feet back, his eyes meeting mine with the same respect he had shown when we first spoke. He did not gloat. He simply opened the office door and gestured toward the conference room where the tenants could come to speak. I asked the clerk to call my son and his wife to a meeting, and when they arrived minutes later, their faces were flushed from a walk they had not expected would end like this. They still believed they were facing some anonymous enemy, some cruel landlord whose name meant nothing to them. That illusion shattered the second I stepped into the room and saw them blink at me as if I had appeared from a photograph they had once tossed aside. My son went from bluster to confusion so fast it looked almost comical, his throat working as if he were trying to find a voice suitable for the moment. His wife clutched her purse, a tiny anchor against the flood of panic rising in her eyes. I sat down opposite them and placed the eviction notices on the table with a calmness that made the paper seem heavier than it should. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The act of setting the papers there was louder than any speech I could have made. Their faces went white as the paper itself. For an instant the room felt like it held its breath, as if the building itself paused to watch the unspooling of a story that had once begun in love and now bent toward consequence. My son reached for the notices like a man reaching for something he did not understand, his fingers trembling. He stammered, "Who is this from? Who do you think you are?" And he spat the words with the same entitlement he had once shown me when he told me to leave. I kept my hands folded. I let the legal language speak for me. There were dates and clauses, references to delinquency if the rent was not paid, and to occupancy rules that left no room for special pleading. I had asked for no more than what the law allowed and no less than what fairness demanded. His wife tried to interrupt, to bargain, to plead, to offer a performance of regret she had never given me when she called me a burden. I watched her mouth the rehearsed words and felt nothing but a cold, steady satisfaction. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was a response with the precision of an instrument. She accused, "This is monstrous. You cannot do this to us." And I answered quietly, "You made your choice." The sentence landed with the weight of all the nights I had worked while they slept, of every meal I had skipped so they might eat, of every debt I had covered while they claimed independence. Silence followed, thick and electric. Neighbors who had gathered at the doorway murmured, faces shifting from curiosity to judgment as they took in the full picture. The power of the document is not in the paper itself, but in what it represents. An end to illusion, a correction of a balance that had been tipped for too long. My son tried once more to charm, to threaten, to blame anyone but himself, listing imagined slights and inventing pretexts. I listened to him like a man cataloging the echoes of his own voice, and when he was done, I stood up. I walked past him, past the kitchen where our laughter had once lived, and I left the room not to gloat but because the work was done. As I closed the door behind me, I heard him call my name, raw and small. I did not turn around. The confrontation erupted like a storm, sudden and violent, though I had expected it, rehearsed it in my mind for weeks. The moment the eviction notices settled into their hands, my son's face twisted with rage, his voice rising in a chaotic mixture of yelling, pleading, and insults that tumbled over one another so quickly they became almost indistinguishable. He demanded to know how I could do this to him, to his family, as if the word family still meant something sacred after he had stripped it of meaning on the night he shoved me out with a suitcase. One moment he called me heartless, the next he accused me of betrayal, and then, without pause, he shouted that I was nothing without him, that I had no right to take away his home. His voice cracked with desperation, but the desperation was buried beneath layers of arrogance he still clung to like armor. His wife was no calmer. She sat upright, her eyes burning with indignation, her mouth pouring venom as she demanded special treatment, insisting they be exempted from the increase, that they be shown mercy because they were not like the other tenants. She spoke as though entitlement alone were currency, as though their blood connection to me was not a bridge they had already burned to ash. Her words dripped with contempt, twisting each sentence into an accusation that I owed them, that I had betrayed some unspoken promise to serve their comfort until my last breath. They both spat words as though volume and cruelty could erase the ink on the deed. I stood there, my hand steady, my breathing slow, and let the storm crash against me without flinching. Their fury was loud, but inside me was only silence, a silence colder and stronger than any insult they could hurl. I had spent too many nights bleeding for their future, too many days being mocked as a burden to let their tantrums stir me now. When the noise reached its peak, when their voices blended into one shrill and frantic chorus, I cut through it with a single sentence, spoken softly but sharp enough to slice the air in two. "You called me an extra mouth," I said, my gaze fixed on them without a tremor. "Consider me removed." The room went still. My son froze, his mouth half open, as if the words had struck him harder than any slap. My daughter-in-law's face paled, her indignation collapsing into something smaller, a flicker of fear she could not mask. In that silence, the weight of their cruelty returned to them, and they seemed to feel, for the first time, the enormity of what they had done. I did not shout, I did not curse, I did not need to. My calmness was more devastating than any outburst, for it showed them I was no longer their victim. I was the man who held their future in his hands, and I would not tremble beneath their scorn again. Their downfall unfolded slowly at first, like a rope fraying strand by strand, until suddenly the whole thing snapped and left them dangling with nothing to hold. After the confrontation, they did what arrogant people always do when cornered. They scrambled. My son began pacing the halls with his phone glued to his ear, calling every friend he had boasted to about cutting off the dead weight. His voice, once full of bravado, now cracked with urgency, as he begged for loans, favors, anything to buy time. But the friends he had once flaunted his pride before were suddenly unavailable, their tones evasive, their excuses flimsy. They had been eager to laugh with him when he mocked me, but when it came to stepping forward in his hour of need, they vanished like smoke. His wife fared no better. She spent her days tapping at her phone, sending message after message, first polite requests and then desperate pleas. She called family members from her side, but they remembered her arrogance, the way she had spoken down to them at gatherings, and they offered nothing but silence in return. She called colleagues, but they dismissed her with cold words, unwilling to tie themselves to her downfall. Their arrogance had left them with no allies, no safety net, and no reservoir of goodwill to draw from. I watched from a distance, unseen but ever present, as they turned their desperation inward, snapping at one another when the calls ended in rejection, when the doors they knocked on remained closed. Their confidence drained like water from a broken glass, and the faces they once wore with such superiority now sagged under the weight of reality. They tried to cut corners, to scrape together money from things they could sell, but their possessions were as shallow as their loyalties. The gadgets, the clothes, the trinkets of their false security fetched almost nothing compared to what they owed. They talked of lawsuits, of fighting the landlord in court, but each lawyer they consulted asked for fees they could not afford, and the more they explained their situation, the more they revealed just how little ground they had to stand on. In the evenings, I saw them sitting by the window, the lights in their apartment dim, their voices no longer raised in triumph, but muffled by despair. The neighbors began to whisper about them, the same neighbors who had once endured their arrogance, their loud complaints, their dismissive sneers. Those neighbors now shook their heads and murmured that it was only a matter of time before the couple was gone. I could see it in the way people avoided them in the hallways, in the way conversation stopped when they walked by. Isolation closed in on them, a mirror of the isolation they had forced on me when they cast me out. Every call unanswered, every plea ignored, was justice delivered without my hand lifting a finger. They had lived as though the world owed them deference, but when the time came to collect, they discovered that arrogance pays no debts, and pride secures no allies. And as their circle shrank to nothing, as even their friends turned their backs, I knew they were finally tasting the loneliness they had once forced upon me. I walked into the apartment like a man stepping into a museum of his own past, carrying nothing but the quiet that had been denied me for so long, and the air inside felt different than the last time I had been here. Then the space had been noisy with laughter that had never included me, heavy with the casual cruelty of people who believed kindness was owed to them. Now it was empty, the furniture reduced to simple lines and shadows, the sounds of their life washed away, and the silence that remained was not an accusation but a benediction. I moved through the rooms with slow, careful steps, fingers brushing the back of a chair they had once pulled away from me, as if I might soil it with my presence. Sunlight pooled on the floor, in the places where their feet had paced in confident circles, where their voices had once filled the air with contempt. I sat on the edge of the bed I had once been pushed from, and let the emptiness around me settle. There was no gloating in me, no triumphant dance, only a deep, settled peace that came from seeing fairness restored. My victory was not a spectacle. It was a restoration of order, a correction for years of being dismissed and erased. I ran my hand over the table, the wood warm from the light, and for a strange moment I allowed myself to remember better days, the smell of stew on cold nights, the tiny hand that had once reached for mine at the doorway, the laughter that belonged to the long-ago child I had raised. Those memories were not erased by what had happened. They existed alongside the betrayal, and today they were part of what made this silence feel whole rather than hollow. Justice, I realized, is a quiet thing when it is done through patience and law. It does not clang pots or slam doors. It slides into place like a key turning in a lock, decisive and final. I had not set out to humiliate anyone. I had not dreamed of making them suffer for suffering's sake. I wanted to be seen. I wanted the simple dignity of being recognized as someone who had given until there was little left. Because they had refused to see me when I asked, the world provided a different kind of recognition, one recorded in deeds and notices and the weight of legal truth. Their absence in this apartment felt like a returned breath. The neighbors who had once rolled their eyes at my presence now nodded politely as I walked by. The same people who had been silent when I was pushed out now offering small courtesies. It was not pity I accepted, but the restoration of normal civility I had always hungered for. I thought of the nights on that street when the cold had felt like an accusation, the times I had doubted myself and wondered if my sacrifices had been in vain. Standing here, those doubts were quieted, not because I had scored a victory, but because the ledger of my life had shifted back toward balance. The law had given me a way to right a wrong, and I had used it with the restraint of someone who knows the value of measured action. I patted the cushion of an empty sofa, and the gesture felt ceremonial, as if I were setting down an old burden. In the silence, I forgave them, not to free them, but to free myself. Forgiveness does not mean forgetting. It means letting go of the corrosive need to be consumed by bitterness. I had my peace now, a peace earned through patient, steady work rather than through the fever of revenge. Walking to the window, I looked out at the street where I had once wandered in humiliation and saw it with new eyes. The evening light softened the building's outlines as if blessing each brick. I smiled once, small and private, and left the apartment not to gloat but to live, knowing that in proving my worth without spectacle, I had reclaimed the one thing no eviction could take from me, my dignity. Family is meant to be cherished, not exploited, and that truth is what remains with me now more than anything else. I spent years believing that love and sacrifice would be enough to hold us together, that the bond of blood could not be broken by greed or arrogance, but I was wrong. My son and his wife forgot the very foundation of family, treating me not as the father who built their world, but as a burden, an extra mouth to feed, and because of that blindness they lost everything. They thought they could erase me, laugh at me, discard me, and still prosper, but life does not reward cruelty forever. Their arrogance left them without allies, their greed left them without stability, and in the end they had no one to blame but themselves. I did not destroy them with anger or violence. I simply let the truth play out, using patience, discipline, and the law to remind them of what they chose to forget. They mocked my sacrifices, but those very sacrifices gave me the strength and the resources to reclaim control. They laughed when they pushed me out, but those laughs became hollow when the roof over their heads turned out to be mine. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.